They called her mad. They called her cursed. But what if the story of Spain's most infamous queen was never madness at all? What if it was a forbidden love story, buried alive in a coffin that traveled with her for years? Juana of Castile, better known as Juana la Loca, wasn't supposed to rule. She wasn't supposed to love so fiercely. And she definitely wasn't supposed to defy kings, priests, and even her own bloodline. Yet she did. And the truth they hid is more shocking than the legend. Imagine a princess who became queen, married a man whose beauty was said to melt hearts, and then refused to let him go even after death. Picture her wandering the Spanish countryside with his coffin, refusing to bury him, clinging to a love that history turned into madness. But what if her so-called insanity was just the price of power in a world determined to silence her? What if Juana wasn't crazy at all, but the victim of betrayal, politics, and a throne soaked in blood and lies? This is the story they never wanted you to hear. The coffin was no longer just wood and iron for Juana. It became a living presence, a dark altar to the only love she had ever known. Night after night she would sit beside it, speaking to Philip as though he still breathed, whispering her grief into the silence. The courtiers were horrified. They said she would not allow women near the coffin for fear that even in death, Philip's beauty might seduce them. They said she would fling herself across the lid, pressing her lips to the cold wood, as if her kisses could wake him. They said she slept beside it, refusing to move, her black veil falling across her face like a shroud. But who recorded these tales? Men who despised her, men who wanted her crown, men who found it convenient to portray her as mad. Was she grieving? Absolutely. Was her grief deeper than custom allowed? Without question. But grief is not madness. Grief is the human heart refusing to obey politics. And Juana's heart, long crushed under duty and betrayal, now poured itself out in raw defiance. Her journey with the coffin became legend. Across the Spanish countryside, peasants awoke to see torchlight on the horizon, a grim procession moving through the night, a carriage carrying a coffin, guarded by monks chanting prayers, and beside it, a veiled queen walking through the mud, her steps steady, her gaze unbroken. Some villagers crossed themselves, whispering of curses and madness. Others wept in silence, seeing not a lunatic, but a woman so consumed by love and loss that she refused to let the earth swallow what remained of her. And yet, her grief was weaponized. Her father, Ferdinand, eager to regain control of Castile, painted her mourning as hysteria. He whispered to nobles that Juana was unfit to rule, that her obsession with Philip's corpse proved she could not bear the weight of a kingdom. The more she clung to the coffin, the easier it became for him to pry the crown from her fingers. What he could not take by force, he stole with stories. Still, Juana resisted. Behind the veil of sorrow burned a spark of her mother's fire. When courtiers demanded she release her husband's body for burial, she refused. "He is mine," she is said to have declared. "He is my king. Where he goes, I go." Was this madness or the last weapon of a queen fighting for her throne? So long as Philip's coffin was by her side, so too was her claim to power. To bury him was to bury her crown. And Juana refused to be buried alive. Her children watched this tragedy unfold, their futures entangled in the storm of grief and ambition. Among them was Charles, the boy who would one day inherit not only Spain but an empire stretching across oceans. But in these moments, they were only frightened children, watching their mother unraveler appear to unravel, while powerful men circled like vultures as the years dragged on. Juana's image grew darker in the eyes of her people. The legend of La Loca spread like wildfire, eclipsing the truth of her struggle. She was no longer seen as the rightful queen, but as a madwoman roaming the countryside with a coffin in tow. Ferdinand seized control. Later, her son Charles would do the same. Juana was locked away in Tordesillas, a palace-turned-prison, where she would spend nearly 50 years of her life. 50 years silenced, hidden, erased, and yet even locked away, even stripped of her crown, she remained Queen of Castile in name. No one could remove that. No one could undo the truth that, for a time, Juana had been the most powerful woman in Spain. They could call her mad, they could chain her to shadows, but they could not erase her bloodline, her children, her legacy. When you hear the story told, they will say Juana was insane, that she lost herself in grief, that she clung to a coffin because she could not let go. But if you look closer, past the slander and the gossip, you will see something else. A woman caught between love and power, betrayed by the men who feared her, remembered only through the lies they told. And perhaps the true madness is not Juana's at all, but history's need to call her La Loca instead of what she really was, queen who would not bow, even to death. The night winds howled across Castile, carrying with them the image of a veiled figure and a coffin that would not rest, and from that image a legend was born. The chill of Castile's winter crept into every stone of Tordesillas, where the wind moaned against barred windows and iron gates clanged like the echoes of a forgotten past. This was not a palace for a queen. It was a prison wrapped in the disguise of royal walls. And inside those walls, Juana of Castile once, crowned with the promise of empire, sat as a shadow of her former self, watching the world continue without her. After the death of Philip the Handsome, Juana's fate should have been clear. She was queen, heiress of Isabella, rightful ruler of Castile. But grief is a dangerous thing when politics waits in ambush. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, moved swiftly, presenting himself as the savior of order. He spread the tale that Juana was unfit to govern, a woman so consumed by madness that she could not even bury her husband's body. The nobles, ever wary of chaos, nodded in uneasy agreement. Better the steady hand of Ferdinand than the trembling hand of La Loca. But Juana was not trembling. Behind her mourning veil, her eyes still burned with defiance. She knew her rights. She knew her lineage. She knew that the blood of Isabella of Castile coursed through her veins, demanding recognition. Yet every time she asserted her authority, Ferdinand countered with whispers of her instability. When she resisted his interference, he locked her away. When she demanded her freedom, he claimed it was for her safety. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. Turn a queen's grief into proof of madness, and her crown becomes yours. The coffin was her last weapon. As long as she clung to Philip's body, she clung to legitimacy. If she buried him, if she let him go, then the men who circled her would bury her throne with him. And so she refused. For years, the coffin traveled with her towns, across fields, from monastery to monastery until, finally, it rested in the cold halls of Tordesillas, and Juana rested beside it, not as a madwoman, but as a queen whose throne had been stolen. Life in Tordesillas was bleak. The palace prison smelled of damp stone and incense, a place of shadows where the sun rarely lingered. Juana's only constant companion was the coffin, draped in velvet, guarded by monks who muttered prayers. Sometimes she spoke to it, her words carrying through the dark corridors like the last notes of a broken hymn. Sometimes she sat in silence for hours, her face veiled, her hands folded as if in endless vigil. The courtiers who spied on her reported every detail back to Ferdinand, each observation twisted into further evidence of her insanity. She refuses to eat, she speaks to the dead, she trusts no one. Piece by piece, the legend of La Loca grew, but behind the bars of her prison, Juana remained a queen. Her children came to visit her hat, first with the innocence of youth, later with the weight of ambition. Charles, the boy who would one day inherit an empire, looked into her eyes and saw both sorrow and strength. He too would one day lock her away, but not before learning from her the cruel truth of power, that crowns are rarely won by love, but by control. Outside her prison, Spain changed. Ferdinand died, leaving Aragon to another heir. Charles grew into a young man, bold and ambitious, and soon he would be crowned Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of lands stretching from Spain to the New World. He carried the future in his hands, but he carried it by keeping his mother locked in the past. Juana remained in Tordesillas, her existence erased from politics, her voice silenced by stone walls, yet whispers of her endured. Travelers spoke of the queen who lived with a coffin, the mad woman of Castile, whose love defied death. Some pitied her, others mocked her, but all remembered her. And in memory lies power. The tragedy of Juana is not only that she was imprisoned, but that her story was stolen. Her grief was turned into madness, her love into ridicule, her crown into chains. Yet, in that silence, she became something more powerful than her captors intended, a legend, a figure half real, half myth, whose very existence still unsettles the stones of Castile, because here is the forbidden truth. Juana la Loca may not have been mad at all. She may have been a queen who loved too deeply, who fought too stubbornly, who refused to bend to the men who wanted her broken. And history, written by those same men, found it easier to call her insane than to admit she had been wronged. The coffin stood in Tordesillas as proof of that wrong. Night after night, it remained beside her, a silent witness to the queen who would not yield. And outside the barred windows, Spain's destiny unfolded, conquests, empires, discoveries, while its rightful queen was reduced to a story told in whispers. The chapter of her life in Tordesillas was not madness. It was survival. It was defiance. It was the long echo of a love and a throne that refused to be buried. The air of Tordesillas was heavy, a mix of damp stone, candle smoke, and the faint scent of incense that lingered long after the monks had finished their prayers. For Juana, the palace-turned prison had become a universe unto itself. Years stretched into decades, marked not by festivals or victories, but by the sound of doors locking, guards shuffling, and the endless echo of her own heartbeat in the silence. She had once been the daughter of the most powerful rulers in Europe. She had once been a bride, swept into passion, by Philip the Handsome. She had once been a queen, crowned with all the glory of Castile. And now she was a ghost that Spain itself had chosen to bury alive. But Juana was not entirely forgotten. Whispers about her persisted, carried across the kingdoms like rumors of an old curse. Villagers spoke of the queen who would not bury her husband, who still sat vigil beside his coffin. Nobles muttered about her whenever they grew restless under Charles V's rule, as if the presence of his imprisoned mother somehow weakened his authority. Even rebels, in moments of desperation, cried out her name as though invoking a phantom might topple an emperor inside her chamber. Juana sat in mourning black, her face veiled, her hands resting on her lap. Across from her stood the coffin age, now its velvet faded, its wood darkened by time. Yet to Juana it was still Philip, still the man who had once kissed her lips and broken her heart, still the presence she could not release. To let him go would be to admit defeat, to concede that her love, her reign, her very identity had been a lie. Sometimes she spoke to him. Sometimes she sang the hymns of her childhood, her voice soft and trembling. At other times she raged, crying out against the betrayal of her father, the indifference of her son, the cruelty of the world that had branded her mad. Servants who overheard these moments returned to their masters with stories that fueled the legend. "The queen is insane," they whispered. "She speaks to the dead." But what those servants could not see was the truth behind her words. Juana was not only grieving a man, she was grieving herself, her freedom, her dignity, her crown. The coffin had become the symbol of everything she had lost, and by clinging to it, she defied those who wanted her erased. Outside the palace walls, Charles V rose to unparalleled power. His empire stretched across Europe and into the Americas. Gold flowed from the New World, battles raged across the continent, and the very structure of Christendom trembled in his hands. Yet, for all his triumphs, his legitimacy rested on a quiet crime, the imprisonment of his mother. He ruled as emperor, but his throne was always shadowed by the woman locked away in Tordesillas. At times, Juana was drawn into his wars without even knowing it. When rebels rose in Castile, they declared her the rightful monarch. Armies marched in her name, though she never saw them. Once, they reached the very gates of Tordesillas. Guards scrambled, nobles panicked, and for a moment the air crackled with possibility. Would she be freed? Would she once again step into the light as queen? But when the rebels begged her to sign their decrees, to give them her authority, Juana refused. Some said she was too broken, too lost in madness to understand. Others believed she knew exactly what she was doing. She would not let herself be turned into a pawn yet again. Not for her father, not for her son, and not for desperate rebels seeking to use her name. In that refusal, Juana showed more strength than history ever admitted. The rebellion failed. Charles crushed it, and Juana was sealed tighter in her prison. Yet, even then, her story would not die. Travelers still carried tales of her coffin, of her vigil, of the queen who lived half in this world and half in the next. Every retelling blurred the line between truth and myth, until Juana became both a woman of flesh and blood, and a legend of sorrow and defiance. As the years passed, her beauty withered, her body weakened, but her presence remained haunting. To some, she was a madwoman chained by grief. To others, she was a tragic heroine who defied the will of kings. and to a few she was still queen, rightful and unbroken, even if her throne was nothing more than a cold stone floor beside a coffin. Her voice echoes through history, not in proclamations or decrees, but in the silence she endured, in the legend she unwillingly created. Juana la Loca was not just the queen who would not bury her husband, she was the queen Spain could not bury, no matter how hard it tried. The winters in Tordesillas seemed endless. Snow pressed against the stone walls, the river froze in silence, and the wind screamed through cracks like a chorus of lost souls. For Juana, the seasons no longer mattered. Every day was the same. Wake to the sound of locks turning, kneel beside the coffin, endure the presence of guards and monks, wait for nightfall. Time blurred, melting years into decades, until her very identity was defined not by life, but by confinement. Yet, even in her silence, she was dangerous. Charles V knew it. Spain knew it. So long as Juana lived, there existed the possibility that someone, somewhere, would rise in her name. She was a living banner, even if she never lifted her voice. And so the watch over her was relentless. Guards patrolled every corridor. Monks watched her prayers. Servants whispered her movements. Every sigh, every glance, every muttered word was recorded, carried beyond the prison walls, and twisted into evidence of her madness. But was it madness? Or was it despair, carefully mislabeled? When she refused food, they said she was insane. When she raged at the guards, they called her hysterical. When she sat in silence, they said she was lost in delusion. No matter what she did, the verdict was always the same: Juana la Loca. The label became a prison tighter than the walls of Tordesillas, and yet she endured. Her endurance was not the endurance of a saint, but of a woman who refused to surrender the last fragments of herself. Her grief for Philip had long since cooled into something heavier, something less like passion and more like defiance. The coffin was not just her husband, it was her throne. It was proof that she had once ruled, that she had once been more than a prisoner. By keeping it, she reminded the world, and perhaps herself, that she had not been erased. Visitors occasionally came, ambassadors, nobles, even her children. They entered expecting to see a madwoman, and often left unsettled by what they found. She was aged, yes, her body frail, her beauty long faded, but her eyes, those dark Castilian eyes, still burned with intelligence. When she chose to speak, her words carried sharpness, clarity, the unmistakable weight of a queen who knew exactly what had been taken from her. Charles himself visited her from time to time. By then, he was not only King of Spain, but Holy Roman Emperor, master of half the known world. He came to her not as a son seeking comfort, but as a ruler ensuring control. Their meetings were strained, their silences louder than their words. Did he feel guilt? Did he see in her the shadow of his own ambition? Or did he, like Ferdinand before him, simply view her as an obstacle conveniently contained? History does not say, but it records this: he never freed her. He needed her imprisoned to remain secure. Outside, Tordesillas' Spain flourished and bled in equal measure. The gold of the New World poured into its treasuries, but wars drained it just as quickly. Empires rose, empires clashed, and still Juana remained in her cell, untouched by history's grand sweep, yet essential to its foundation. For without her, Charles would not have reigned. Without her, the empire would not have been his. She was both absent and omnipresent, erased yet indispensable. In her later years, her health declined. She suffered pains, fevers, weakness that chained her body even as her spirit clung to its last shreds of resistance. The monks around her interpreted her suffering as punishment for sin. To Juana, it was perhaps the final cruelty of a life defined by betrayal. She had been queen, wife, mother, prisoner, legend, and now she was simply old, worn down by decades of isolation. And yet, even as death crept closer, she remained bound to Philip. His coffin never left her side. It stood there through every season, through every whisper, through every long night of despair. A coffin that had once shocked the kingdom became as ordinary as a piece of furniture in her chamber. But for Juana, it was still everything: her love, her loss, her throne, her story. When she finally passed in 1555, after nearly 50 years of confinement, Spain did not mourn her as it should have. Her death was noted, acknowledged, and quickly overshadowed by the empire's affairs. She was buried at last beside Philip, the husband she had loved and hated, the man whose beauty had changed her life and whose coffin had defined her legend. But in truth, Juana had never been laid to rest. Her story lived on, whispered in villages, written in chronicles, retold by poets. Some pitied her, others mocked her, but none could forget her. She was Juana la Loca, the mad queen who would not bury her husband, the prisoner who outlived her captors, the ghost who haunted Spain long after her body was gone. And perhaps that is her final victory. For while Ferdinand and Charles wielded crowns, armies, and empires, Juana wielded something they could never control: memory. They tried to silence her, erase her, bury her alive. Instead, they created a legend that outlasted them all. The bells of Tordesillas tolled heavy in the year 1555, their sound rolling across the river like the sigh of history itself. After nearly half a century of confinement, Juana of Castile, the queen the world called La Loca, took her final breath. Her death was quiet, unmarked by great fanfare, overshadowed by the affairs of the empire her blood had built. But her story did not end in silence. It began to echo louder than ever. Her body, worn down by years of grief, was laid beside Philip's in Granada. At last, she rested in death, where she had refused to let him rest in life. To those who buried her, it may have seemed like a fitting conclusion: the mad queen united eternally with her beloved husband. Yet the truth was far more haunting. Juana had been imprisoned, not by her love, but by the ambitions of men who feared her power. In the end, her coffin vigil became the perfect mask for their crime. By calling her insane, they justified their theft of her throne. But history has a way of unraveling lies. Over the centuries, scholars, poets, and storytellers returned to Juana's tale, peeling back the layers of slander. They asked the forbidden questions. Was she truly matter? Was she a victim of betrayal? Was her love for Philip unnatural? Or was it simply magnified by grief and politics? Was she clinging to a coffin because she lost her mind, or because she understood that the coffin was the last symbol of her legitimacy? The answers are elusive, blurred by centuries of rumor. But one truth shines through. Juana was far more than the caricature history painted. She was a daughter of Spain's most powerful monarchs, a queen crowned by blood, a woman caught in a web of ambition, and a mother whose children inherited an empire forged through her lineage. She was not merely La Loca. She was Juana, Queen of Castile. Even in death, her legend refused to fade. Travelers whispered her story. Artists painted her grief. Writers described her as a tragic heroine, a woman too human for the cruel machinery of politics. Some cast her as a victim, others as a symbol of undying love. And in every retelling, her presence grew stronger, not weaker. The very label meant to destroy her madness became the reason she was remembered at all. Meanwhile, the men who had confined Ferdinand, Philip, Charles passed into history as rulers, warriors, and emperors. Their achievements are recorded in chronicles, their names etched in stone. But ask a passerby today, and many will not know their stories in detail. Yet, Juana's name endures, surrounded by fire and sorrow, invoked as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of defiance. In the end, she eclipsed them. Picture it, the ghost of a queen still wandering the corridors of Tordesillas, her black veil trailing across cold stone, her eyes fixed on the coffin that never left her side. Centuries later, the walls of that prison still stand, silent witnesses to the woman who refused to be forgotten. Visitors say they can feel her presence there, as if Juana herself lingers, waiting, watching, reminding Spain that she once was queen. Her tragedy is universal. How many women across history have been silenced by being called mad, their passion recast as hysteria, their grief twisted into weakness, their defiance labeled insanity? Juana's story is not just hers. It is the story of every voice denied, every truth rewritten, every woman erased by fear of her power. And so, Juana's legend endures not as madness, but as memory. She was the queen who loved too fiercely, who mourned too openly, who refused to let go when the world demanded her silence. They called her La Loca, but perhaps the real madness was the world that caged her, the men who stole her crown, and the history that tried to bury her alive. As the bells tolled over Castile that winter morning, Spain moved on, its empire expanding, its rulers shifting. But somewhere in the whispers of wind over the stones of Tordesillas, a voice lingers still, the voice of Juana, the queen who would not yield, the woman who would not be erased.